Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session at the Reagan Institute Summit on Education. My name is Paul Fain. I'm a longtime higher ed journalist, these days focused on connections between education and work. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Missouri Governor Mike Parson. Governor Parson, how are you?
Hey, I'm fine, Paul. Good to be on.
Thanks very much for being here with me. Let's jump right in. So you've made workforce development and its alignment with post-secondary education a top priority. Just want to get a sense for you personally, why has this become such an important issue, and where do you see the challenges and opportunities for change?
I think the why is because when you really get in a position to be governor of the state of Missouri, what is it you can really do to make a difference? And I think when I got that opportunity, the things I realized is I really wanted to concentrate on workforce development and infrastructure. And when you put workforce development at the forefront and you make it a priority and stay with that priority, which we have now for 5 years, you're really getting to see the positive impact of it. But when I talk about workforce development, that all starts with the child. And that means how do you make sure you're preparing for the workforce of tomorrow? And what is it you do good? And what is it you do you're not doing very well? And I think in this state, when we began really focusing on workforce development, we had to realize that we had to do a better job of communication between the education community and the business community and the people that really had the demand of the workforce. Because what you find out sometimes is you think sometimes the education community knows what's best for everybody, and government thinks they know what's best for everybody. And the private sector is the one that ends up with whatever they get. And what we really did is we took DED, or Department of Economic Development, we took it out of their sole department by themselves, and we put it into higher education to really bring those two together to say, okay, what is it we can really be teaching our kids about the workforce of tomorrow? And the truth be known, not everybody's going to be doctors, not everybody's going to be architects and engineers. No, we need them, and we need that higher education piece. But we've also got to figure out how are we going to utilize the community colleges to their max? How are we going to use training centers to be able to prepare this? And how do you tell a high school kid, a young high school kid, what his future might look like? And not be afraid to tell them that there's maybe just not one path, it's maybe multiple paths that you can get there. So I think in our state, we really set that as a main goal to figure out how do we touch so many of those kids, and how do we really know what a CEO, what a corporation, what companies want, not only for today, but for the future. What does the education goals need to be to prepare for that? And I think it's what's made our state so successful and really have become a model for a lot of states around the United States of what we're doing, how we're investing our money in it. And then again, what do you expect out of that? And at the end of the day, it's why Missouri, for example, is third in the United States for apprenticeships, because we put to work what it is we said we're going to do. And we started making sure young people understood what areas they may be suited for as they go through the education to the career workforce. So it takes a lot of hard work. It's not easy to change people's minds when they've done things for years and years. But I think that kind of go along with what this interview is about. Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, had this vision 40 years ago. And to be able to go where we're going today, and you wonder, how do we keep building on what was done then? And how do we make sure expand it to the future? So for me, it's about making sure that the future is bright for a lot of young men and young women that's going to go in the workforce. And how do we partner with those people to make it better? So there's a lot of things we're doing in here and there. In our state, we got the lowest unemployment rate in our state's history because we're really concentrating on putting people back to work. We have work centers in almost 114 counties. We have work centers in probably 104 of those counties. Almost 90% of our counties have their own workforce entities set up within the county to make sure they know what are the jobs in that area and what do high school students need to be understanding to be able to apply for those jobs someday, all the way from Boeing corporations, heavy corporations, Boeing, Ford Motor Company, to the smallest ones we have. We keep trying to build that workforce of tomorrow.
I'm really glad you mentioned starting early for folks starting in early high school, middle school. Can you give me a sense of how much of that is about just showing young Missourians what's even possible? What sort of careers and professions might be available to them?
Well, I think that's part of your career opportunities you have in your high school levels. And I think hands-on experience. we want kids to go to an emergency room, for an example, or to a hospital or to a manufacturing company to see what that work floor is like. You may say you want to be a nurse or a doctor, but you may take one visit to an emergency room and says, hey, this is not for me. This is not what I want to do. And maybe you want to go into a specialized training in healthcare instead of naturally just being some of the, I guess, the high profile things in the medical field. So I think by taking kids out of a classroom and taking them into the workforce themselves to say, is this what you like to do? And expose them to what those real life opportunities are. And I think that's been very successful us. I think one of the other things we really encourage is career counselors in high schools to actually go out in the workforce. If you're going to have continuing education in any state, any governor is going to have that. One of those prerequisites should be that you make sure your career counselors actually go to the workforce and know what it's like. Many of them have not been exposed to what a job is on a real site. And I think the more that we can do, whether it's construction, whether it's engineering, whether it's architect, whether it's healthcare, all the things that we know are fast growing industry out there, you got to make sure and give these kids an opportunity to know that. But the education community also has to be a part of that. I mean, it's about all of us working together to make sure we're exposing young people to the future and the jobs of tomorrow.
Can you give us a little bit of a sense of who stands to benefit the most in your state from these long-running efforts to ensure that education does lead to a good job? What are the industries and professions as well that you see as most in need of that better alignment?
Well, I don't think there's any question when you start trying to create jobs in today's world, people to retain their business, to expand their business, or bring new businesses in, you're going to be talking about the workforce. And people are going to understand what states are really aggressive at that and which ones are not. But you have to accelerate. I mean, you have to be full steam ahead to make sure you're building a workforce tomorrow for people to make sure that your state is going to be prosperous. And I think, to me, that's just a priority every governor should have. If you're not doing that, you're not looking further enough down the road to figure out what is it people are going to be looking for. And I think when you look at business, like, and I'll use Boeing for an example. Boeing now, we actually let them take part of their education, part of their criteria to the education community, into high schools to say, what is it you're looking for? And a high school kid could actually take that training on their own, volunteer to do it, and then Boeing will pick them up and help them with their education after that. Is one example. How do we benefit for that? Number two, as a governor, of course, I'm high on Missouri to say the least, but I want to be able to keep my young people in this state. I want to be able to provide them jobs. I want to be able to provide them opportunities. But how it benefits the communities and your families is what is the structure of your state? I want people to get a world-class education. And it doesn't matter to me whether it's a welder or it's a doctor or it's an engineer, it's a healthcare specialist. Because one thing I know, that individual can go anywhere they want and they're going to be valuable in the workforce of tomorrow. And I think those are the things that are critical. And that's how we benefit from the state, and why. For us, last year, $2.3 billion in new businesses coming to our state and expansions because of that workforce initiatives that we're putting forward.
Isn't part of this also about getting folks who aren't participating in either education or workforce back into one of those systems? I mean, I know nationwide college enrollments are down, particularly community colleges. And I know also you've got folks who've been in prison, the formerly incarcerated, that, I know in your state are looking to get back on track.
Yeah, I think perfect examples. Let me tell you an example we found out in our state. You take somebody that is 18, 19 years old and they get out of high school. They may have lots of dreams that they think of at 18, 19 years old, but they may not be a reality at the end of the day. People may get married, they may have children, they may start to college and they may drop out and they may go into the workforce. And we first of all, you got to realize that is a huge part of your population, of your workforce that's out there. So what we did in this state, we actually took a program, what we call Fast Track. So somebody 25 years of age and older, and that's just an arbitrary number we used on the 25, but we will actually bring them back into the education community, to our community colleges, to our training centers, all the way to 4 years for high demand jobs, and pay for their education to come back into the workforce and to up their skills and to be able to get a better paying job. when we did that program, and it was before COVID and it kind of went through the COVID situation, 80% of the people that were involved in fast track program were women that had made different changes in their lives, whatever, but 80% of those come back in. And over 50% of them was in the healthcare industry, which was surely a blessing in disguise for all we've been through here lately. But I think it's programs like that, realizing who are the people out there that need a little bit of help. And I'll always stress they never need a hand out, they need a hand up. And I think these are perfect examples we can do to build the workforce of tomorrow. And I think that was one of the programs we put in there. And then just to make sure that you expose people to it and you reach out to them and say, it's okay to continue your education.
Like another program in January, you announced a $30 million investment in the workforce training grant program. What does that investment mean for folks in the state? And I mean, worker learners and employers alike.
Yeah, well, I think number one, again, you have to partner with employers. I mean, you have to go out there and find out what is the need they want, what do they expect out of their workers, and how do you train them? So when we do workforce development grants, we call them, as you mentioned there, all right, we want to first of all go to that company and say, okay, what is kind of training do you want to have somebody to come to work for you? So how do we help do that? And then how do we provide those services, whether that's a training institute, a community colleges, to make sure they design that education program to meet the demands of those companies and corporations out there? And I'll give you an example we all know, IT. IT is just a huge demand in today's world. But it's not just going and getting a basic IT training. It's what is it you want to specialize in IT? And I think those are the examples we use with these programs to be able to really help with the businesses to partner with them and says, okay, we want to help you obtain the skills you need to hire good people from our state to go to work for you. And those are some of the grant programs that we're trying to put in place all the time. Again, heavy emphasis on the workforce development piece. If you are going to change people's lives, and again, I will go back to workforce development begins in the beginning. It begins with a child. First of all, you got to have an education. You've got to get that done in your states, and you got to put a priority on it. But then as they go through that education process, you have to give them the tools they need that really is going to help them in society and is really going to do something about the workforce of tomorrow. Because if they can get a good job, they can get a good paying job, then the American dream is at hand. All they have to do is be able to fulfill that dream.
So as you know well, a lot of the jobs out there have been going to folks with four-year degrees. There's a big effort afoot by folks of both political sides of the aisle to open up doors to folks without four-year degrees. Can you give me a sense of how some of the work you're doing in workforce development is aimed at those people as well?
Yeah, Paul, the good thing about this is workforce development should never be a Democrat, Republican issue or a political issue. Workforce development is good for everyone. It's good for our young kids. It's good for our families. It's good for the tomorrow of our states and of our country. And you've got to be able to work on these issues with people from different parties, with different areas of the state. Missouri is such a state, it's so diverse. And you got St. Louis, Kansas City on the corners, you got rural Missouri, and you have all representations in state capital. But at the end of the day, I want to go back. You got to find the common ground. Does everybody want a kid educated? Do you want to make sure they're learning the skills they need to go into the workforce? Do you want your businesses to stay here? Do you want to retain them? Do you want to broaden that base of business coming to your state? And the only way you can do that is working together to make sure that we get programs in place that is successful for the General Assembly as a whole, just not segments of it. And I think it's one of the things you got to learn from being governor. It's about what is the best thing for the people of your state. And the vast majority of the time, it is the best thing for America if you're doing the best thing for your state.
Well, as you know, I'm glad you brought this up. The seminal report, A Nation at Risk, was published 40 years ago. President Reagan sought to see policymakers work across the aisle and come together to effect change. You've had success doing that here. Can you give me a sense of how to keep workforce education something that people can really get a hold of no matter which state they're in? I mean, Missouri, as you mentioned, has a lot of diversity, a lot of different workforces, frankly, across the state. How can this work in California as well as Texas or North Dakota?
Yeah, you know, I think in the political arena today, things are so divisive, as you say on the federal level, as we go through these things, and everybody wants to deal with hot button political issues, where they get a soundbite, you know, on the news reels or things of that. I think you got to humble yourself to go back to the beginning. Why is it you're sitting in the seat you're sitting in today? What did you think when you was going to be a legislator when you first come up there? And I always say, remember that day, because when you first come to a Capitol building, you had one mission in mind, and that was to try to make home better. It was to try to make sure you're representing people back home, no matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. That's what most of us come up here for. The point of it is you need to stay focused on that very simple mission statement you had when you first come up here, and you got to work with each other. Again, I'll mention to you, workforce development, infrastructure, those are not Democrat, Republican issues. They are good for this country. They're good for all of our states. And we need to figure out what we can agree on, what we can disagree on. I know here in Missouri, I work with the Democrat, the other side of the aisle a lot. And you know, there are some things we're always going to disagree on. We understand that. We know that. Those are not the things we're discussing here. We're discussing, okay, let's talk about the things we agree on. Let's talk about how do we build a workforce of tomorrow. So how can we all go together, put a plan together, put the finances together, and make sure we're going to every county in the state that benefits from such things as career centers that we talked about before. You know, I've always felt like if people will just try to sit at the table, and if there is a solution to be found, I think most people can find a solution. And I think the one thing politicians have got to get out of their system, and I tell my people this all the time, my senior staff, it's never about being the best. It's about making everybody around you better. That's how you come up with real solutions.
Absolutely. So, you mentioned changing folks' minds here. I know that can be employers thinking differently about hiring pipelines. That can be educators about which programs are most in need. It can be students, as we talked about earlier, thinking about their career options earlier in their lives. Can you give me a sense of where you are right now in terms of helping folks think beyond that four-year degree again? Because that's still a good option for a lot of people. It's not the only one. And it is seared on a lot of people's minds.
Well, I think, Paul, first thing you got to do is realize that all three are just as important as any one. You know, you can't emphasize everything on a four-year degree. That won't meet the workforce of tomorrow, as much as maybe some people would think that, but it really won't. You've got to be able to understand that community colleges are just as important at the higher institution of the four-year campuses. And you also have to realize your training centers, you know, some of them 1 year, some of them 6 months, are just as vital. Because if you don't have all aspects of those education communities working with the private sector, you're going to fail. You just cannot keep going and put everything in one basket and think you're going to be able to do a good job when it comes to workforce development. All of those things have to work simultaneously, whether it's 4 years, whether it's community college, whether it's training, and your high schools have to understand that all three are important, because those kids, no matter what school you go to, are going to end up in one of those three categories.
Absolutely. You've been talking about how consistent you all have been in working on this for years now. And you're also breaking down silos in the process between K-12, education, higher education, the workforce, employers. Can you give me a sense of just how important trust and consistency are when it comes to these efforts to make sure that everybody's really at the table in a meaningful way?
Yeah, well, good question, because it is a gutsy call when you start going out there and all of a sudden you think you're going to tell higher education institution, hey, we want you to change what you've been doing for years and years. We want you to look outside the box. It's never easy, because always people think the way we do it's the best way. But I will tell you, that's the biggest downfall of government, because people, when you ask people, say, well, we've done it because we've done it all along this way. That doesn't mean it's right. And it doesn't mean you can't change and meet those demands. So the first thing you have to do is you have to get the trust of higher education, community colleges, and K through 12 on the same page to say, look, we are going to change the way we deliver education in this state. And the private sector is going to be a partnership in this. It's not going to be you deciding what's best for the business community out there. They're going to have a say in that. And then I think for me as the governor or legislators or the people involved in this process, you got to make sure you give, if you're going to tell them to change the way they do business, you got to make sure you support them. You got to make sure, one, you stand up behind them and says, yes, this is the right path to go down. And yes, if that means financially making changes to different education arenas, then you got to invest more in it. And I would say this, you got to realize too, I think in the education community, you know, what is really the demand of the workforce? I mean, you can have a lot of degrees over there, but if there's not a demand for it, and you get somebody going through the ranks of this, they have a great deal of debt, and you walk out of there and your demand's a $30,000, $40,000 job, you need to be honest with people and say, hey, maybe this is not the best place and for your investment on this. So those are all things you got to come together and figure out. What is it does higher education do well? You know, what the community colleges do well, the training centers and education. And you got to admit what you don't do so well. That's always hard to do. I tell you, it's not easy, but if you really want to be successful, you have to evaluate yourself first.
Obviously, it's an unusual job market right now. There's still great demand for tech jobs, and the tech industry moves so fast. I think it's safe to say that most people think industry is going to have to get more involved, more hands-on with education to see the talent that they need. Can you give me a sense in your state, the level of participation and urgency that you see in employers realizing that whatever level of engagement they've had, they're going to need more?
Well, I don't think there's any question how that's changed. I think employers, I want to say old school, just used to wait for people to graduate out of college and then they'd go pick people. That was pretty well a standard way you did it. It's not that way anymore. Number one, which is a good thing, is competition. People are really looking for good, educated, quality workers with skills in there. They want those people. And not only that, they're wanting to figure out how do they build more of that bench? How do they make more and more people available for that? I have never in my career, and I've been around a while, have never seen the businesses started getting involved with K through 12 education, through high school education, more than they are today in our state, because they realized the competitions that's out there. And I'll give you an example. You know, Missouri's one of our number one industries is agriculture, and everybody knows that from the Midwest. But you know, the days of being a farmer like it was when my dad was there, my grandpa, those days are over. You got to be tech savvy to be in agriculture anymore, in all elements of it, that you got to be able to do that. And people are starting to realize that, hey, if you can find somebody that has the capability of learning those skills in high school, what it is I need for them to come to work for my company, my corporation, my business, they're going to help you do that. So the private sector is also investing in that education community. But it right now, it's all hands on deck. I'm going to tell you, if you're a young person getting ready to go in the workforce out there, you need to be figuring out what it is you want to do. And then I think your goals as high as they want to make them. You can do whatever you want to do.
You mentioned that Missouri, Governor Parson is among the top states for apprenticeships. Can you give me a sense of how bullish you are on that sort of experiential learning option, the learn and earn that, you know, it seems to be something that folks from across, again, all over the country really think is a great way to get your foot in the door?
So I think we were trying to develop 20,000 new apprenticeships in our state to meet those demands. And, you know, we set that goal when I first became governor, and I've been governor now for 5 years. We set that for a 5-year goal. We're 3 years ahead of that goal because that demand's out there, and we're putting these apprenticeship programs out there. And I'll tell you right now, any governor that be listening to this, which I'm fine with, and want them to hear what we're doing here, but I'm telling you, it's about competition. And, you know, we're going to work hard, and we want other people to work harder to be able to same opportunities. Because if we all work hard like this, our country becomes hard. It becomes a better place. It becomes a better competitive market when we have to go against all the global countries in this world. If we keep doing it state by state and putting our priorities on workforce development, we all win by that. This nation wins by it. The country wins by it. And those are the things we're doing. Yeah, I'm competitive. And, you know, I'm going to try to get everything I can to make sure I bring businesses here, to make sure I have the workforce in place. But I have to make sure I'm making workforce a priority. And I got to be able to fund it. I got to be able to support it. And I got to make sure and hold people's toe to the line that says, look, you know, I said we're going to go out here and we're going to meet these goals. You got to do it. You just can't say it. We got to prove it so that we can do that. So, it's about accomplishing a mission. It's about setting a mission out there and making sure everybody follows you and you get it done.
Well, congratulations for beating your goals on the apprenticeships. For other state folks out there, state leaders, whether it's governors, legislators, agency directors, you've touched on a lot of topics here. Can you give us a sense of just some of the keys to making this really work? To following Missouri's lead in prioritizing this issue.
Yeah, I think it just comes back to basic fundamental values. We all care about the next generations. Most of us that are listening to this interview today wouldn't be sitting in here listening to this or being part of this organization if it hadn't have been for the people before us. And I think our main goal is to make sure that those next generations have the same opportunities that we've had. And that should be the focus of all of us. And you want it to be a better generation. You want to give them more tools, more skills, more opportunities to really just decide what their path of life is. And I think for all of us, when I talk to people all the time, I say, hey, your main focus is how do you make it better? How do you really move your state forward? How do you improve somebody's life that maybe has struggled for a long time, but all of a sudden you give them an opportunity like fast track, or you says, hey, if you'll up your training, you'll up your skills, we can get you a better paying job. You can have a better car, you can have a better house, you can have a better family environment. The things that the American dream are made out of is the opportunities we have to help people. And I think you have to continually stay focused on what is the opportunities of tomorrow.
Make a case really for workforce education and better alignment as really a top issue for a state. I mean, would you put this as in your top handful of priorities for the state?
Well, I've definitely made it a priority for 5 years, and I firmly believe if you really want to change things, I will even tell you that if you want to change society as a whole, whether it's healthcare, whether it's crime, all of the things that we see today, it all starts with a child, and you have to get them an education. You have to get them in a classroom, and it doesn't matter to me what school that is or what base it comes from, but they got to have an education. They got to be able to fulfill that, to be able to have an opportunity to have a job. So that cycle starts when it's a child, and the long-term objective for all of us should be is how do you make that possible for our young people, and how do we execute that plan to give them an opportunity so someday they're sitting in all the seats we're sitting in today.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Governor Parson, thank you so much for joining this conversation and for your engagement with the Reagan Institute. And thanks to everyone else who tuned in.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for what you all represent. Appreciate you having me on. Thank you.